By the glow of a tallow candle, you're sitting in a drafty stone hall somewhere in 13th century London. The light flickers gently, casting uneven shadows on the wooden table before you. The smell in the room is equal parts smoke, grease, and warm beeswax. This is not the home of nobility, nor a parish office. It is the common workspace of the chandlers, a guild of candle makers who, though rarely mentioned in the grand histories, quietly fueled medieval evenings with light. To understand why these tradesmen, and occasionally women, formed a union, or what we'd now call a guild, you must first understand their strange little world. The problem with darkness before the luxury of gas lamps, or even the oil lanterns that preceded them, light, was a rare commodity. Once the sun dipped behind the hills, darkness settled fast. Only candles, rushlights, or carefully rationed hearth fires could hold it at bay. In wealthier households, beeswax candles were the standard, clean-burning, sweet-smelling, and long-lasting. But these were expensive, largely reserved for churches or noble families. For everyone else, there was tallow. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat. They smoked, they stank, and they sputtered. But they were affordable. A peasant's home might have only one candle to last several nights. That single flicker was entrusted with more than just illumination. It helped children read their psalms, helped midwives assist births, and helped husbands finish their wool-spinning quotas. A sticky, smelly job candle making was not glamorous. The chandlers worked in open workshops near livestock markets, slaughterhouses, or city gates. First, they boiled down fat or melted blocks of beeswax. Then came the dipping. Again and again, the wick was lowered into the vat, cooled, and dipped again until a usable thickness formed. It took hours. The air in these shops was humid and cloying, filled with the scent of offal or sweet wax, depending on the day's materials. Rats were a constant nuisance. And yet these men were artisans. The proportions of wax to tallow, the length of a standard wick, the color of a finished candle. Each detail mattered. So did the price. Early regulations and rivalries. In the 12th and 13th centuries, candles were as valuable as food staples. Unsurprisingly, disputes flared up. Some chandlers cut their beeswax with cheaper fats. Others shaved candles to sell smaller ones as full size. Customers noticed, and they complained. London's authorities, eager to maintain trust in market transactions, introduced basic quality controls. These rules were enforced not by kings or bishops, but by the candlemakers themselves. And so, a kind of union emerged. Guilds didn't just protect wages, they protected reputation. By 1276, the Worshipful Company of Wax Chandlers was formally recognized in London. Soon after, the tallow chandlers followed suit. Their roles were distinct. Wax chandlers supplied cathedrals and rich estates. Tallow chandlers supplied everyone else. They coexisted uneasily, with strict rules about who could sell what and where. The guild mentality. To join a guild, one began as an apprentice. A boy, usually about 12, would live with a master chandler for 7 years. He would learn the craft, but also the business. How to price a candle, how to test wax purity, how to negotiate with the parish priest. Only after years of obedience and skill could he become a journeyman, allowed to earn wages, and eventually open his own stall. At that point, he might petition for full membership in the guild, gaining the right to vote on rules, inspect shops, and wear the official badge. But membership wasn't just about prestige. It offered protection. In an era without labor laws, guilds set minimum prices, limited working hours, and resolved disputes internally. They also paid for funerals, covered costs during illness, and cared for widows. Some nights, a dying candle marked the hour when a chandler could finally rest. But if the candle burned longer than expected, well, it meant he'd be working past dark. Again, fires and fines. The profession came with risk. Hot wax spilled easily. Tallow pots caught fire. If a chandler's shop ignited, it could take a whole street with it. Regulations grew stricter. No open flame within so many feet of the workshop, no unattended wax boiling, and regular inspections by guild-appointed wardens. Warden visits were as much about solidarity as scrutiny. They ensured every member met standards, but also checked on apprentices' well-being and advised on supplier issues. This unity, this quiet chain of support, was what kept the guild alive for centuries. But what would happen when candles were no longer the primary source of light? What would become of the chandlers then? When you think of labor strikes, you likely picture 19th century factories or picket lines outside textile mills. But even in the soot-smudged twilight of the 14th century, chandlers, especially those in larger cities like London, York, and Paris, knew how to make their grievances known, not by loud marches or banners, but by shutting their doors, snuffing their flames, and letting darkness do the talking. The candle guilds, particularly the tallow chandlers and wax chandlers in London, had become economic cornerstones by the 1300s. Their influence extended from humble households to royal courtrooms, and they knew it. If a church needed candles for Mass, it had to go through them. If a magistrate wanted to light a town square, he consulted the guild. Their power wasn't loud, but it was constant, like the flame they produced. The quiet fire of Solidarity Guild membership soared after the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, when food shortages and unrest made people value predictable crafts more than ever. Amid the chaos, candlemakers offered something rare: stability. Homes needed light. Churches needed more. And as plague, war, and poverty spread across Europe, the candle, simple, mundane, and slightly smelly, became a symbol of continuity. The guilds responded by tightening their codes. Only approved members could sell candles in official markets. Inspections increased. Apprenticeship contracts were notarized and preserved in wax-sealed scrolls. Wardens carried brass-tipped rods to tap defective candles and fine violators on the spot. When a rogue seller appeared, say, a butcher who tried making and selling his own tallow candles from leftover fat, he was summoned to a chamber of inquiry, fined and occasionally barred from candle commerce altogether. These weren't casual squabbles. Candle guilds had teeth. The battle of the waxes at the heart of their structure was one oddly persistent rivalry: tallow versus wax. Wax chandlers had prestige. Their candles burned longer and cleaner, and were used in royal chapels, monasteries, and high courts. Tallow chandlers had numbers. Their product reached the working class, taverns, and lowly parish churches. Though both groups made candles, they viewed each other with wary distance. Tallow was, after all, associated with the mundane: animal byproducts, boiling pots, and reek. Wax was holy. It symbolized purity, even resurrection in Christian rituals. Still, wax was expensive. Most city folk lit their homes with tallow candles and reserved a single beeswax taper for high holy days. Guilds maintained this divide with fastidious attention. Wax chandlers were forbidden from using tallow. Tallow chandlers could not advertise their candles as refined or for ecclesiastical use. Each group patrolled its turf, reported transgressions, and at times bribed city officials to retain their privileges. Candlemakers and cathedrals by the mid-14th century. Churches accounted for nearly 30% of all candle sales in urban centers. Every Mass, every prayer vigil, every saint's feast required candles, often in dozens or even hundreds. Major cathedrals spent entire lines in their annual ledgers on candle expenses. In return, they expected perfection. Candles had to burn, evenly with little smoke. They had to be molded in precise sizes. Some guilds developed wax measuring boards. carved planks with grooves to test the width and weight of finished tapers. If one candle was too light, it was rejected. Too heavy? It was taxed extra. This scrutiny fostered innovation. Makers experimented with wick braiding patterns to reduce dripping, added scent, usually myrrh or lavender, to offset the smell, and introduced carved candle holders designed for better heat distribution. Some chandlers even maintained sacred partnerships with specific monasteries. In these cases, they tithed their income in exchange for steady commissions and spiritual blessings. It was an early version of supply chain loyalty, spiced with incense and eternal salvation. A subtle kind of protest, of course. With monopoly came protest. Journeyman chandlers sometimes clashed with their masters over wages. They'd meet in taverns and hatch quiet resistance, refusing overtime, intentionally underdipping wicks, or delaying large orders. These actions didn't cause riots. They caused dark chapels. Records from 1374 show at least 2 documented lighting stoppages in York and Bruges, where guild members withdrew their labor over new price caps on wax imports. Priests were forced to use low-quality tallow substitutes. Congregants complained. The bishops took notice. Eventually, the restrictions were lifted, and the guilds reinstated their candle contracts, one quiet flame at a time. Fires, fines, and urban panic. Still, the biggest threat to chandlers wasn't competition. It was fire. The act of making candles was dangerous. Tallow pots could boil over. Wax caught fire if overheated. A careless apprentice with a poorly maintained wick dipper could tip hot fat onto wooden floors, igniting the whole shop. Medieval cities, built of timber, packed with thatched roofs and narrow alleys, feared fire more than plague. And chandlers were at the center of that fear. Guild ordinances required chandlers to keep sand buckets near vats, store extra wax in stone chests, and never leave boiling pots unattended. If a shop caught fire, the owner was fined. If that fire spread, he could be imprisoned or worse, stripped of his guild rights. In 1392, a major fire in Rouen began in a chandler's workshop and destroyed 9 city blocks. It's one of the few times candle making is mentioned in the city's judicial chronicles. The chandler survived. His guild did not. Within 5 years, Rouen's candle guild was dissolved and replaced with direct city oversight. The role of women and candle widows. Although most master chandlers were men, women participated too, usually as wives, widows, or daughters of established craftsmen. A clause in many guild charters allowed a widow to continue her husband's business if she had observed and assisted in the work. Some of these women became successful chandlers in their own right. City rolls from Ghent and Cologne list over 30 women officially registered as candlemakers by the early 1400s. They were often called candle widows, and sometimes earned more than male journeymen. But their work wasn't only practical. Some added decorative elements, spiral tapers, carved saints, embedded herbs. These flourishes made their candles popular at fairs, wedding ceremonies, and death rites. Despite restrictions, women left their mark, quietly, persistently, and with a steady hand. The rise of municipal contracts. In the late 1300s, towns began hiring chandlers for public lighting. This marked a shift in the guild's power. No longer were they only supplying homes and churches. They were lighting entire cities. Municipal contracts came with prestige and pressure. Chandlers had to calculate burn time, candle width, and weather impact. Was the wind stronger in the northern square? Then add 2 ounces of wax per taper. Would the fog roll in during late November? Double the order. These calculations filled parchment after parchment. The Chandler's Hall in London kept entire ledgers dedicated to city contracts, wax inventories, and apprentice rosters. At its peak, the London Wax Chandlers Guild handled over 10,000 pounds of beeswax per year. That wax came not just from local beekeepers, but from as far as Spain and Cyprus. Long-distance trade meant long-distance quality issues, and the guild grew ever more watchful. But deep down, they must have known change was coming. A new light was on the horizon. What invention would make the very idea of a candle quaint? You sit now in a quiet back room above a shop in Tudor-era London. The candles flicker less here, not because the air is calmer, but because the city outside is changing. Below you, cobblestone alleys are humming with the new rhythm of carts, commerce, and something foreign to chandlers: unpredictability. For 3 centuries, the candle guilds ruled the darkness. But by the 16th century, cracks were beginning to show. A silent kind of revolution was on its way, powered not by rebellion, but by oil, innovation, and a shift in how people lit their lives. Whale oil and the smell of progress. The first major blow came from the sea. Whale oil, imported at scale from places like Greenland and later the Americas, offered a cleaner burning alternative to tallow at a lower price. It could be refined into lamp oil and burned longer, without the pungent animal smell. Merchants began importing whale oil in bulk by the early 1500s. Oil lamps quickly became fixtures in wealthier households. They were easier to manage, didn't drip wax, and, unlike candles, could be dimmed or brightened. Candle guilds tried to protest. Some even petitioned city officials to ban the import of foreign oil. They cited moral concerns over the cruelty of whale hunting. But deep down, they knew it wasn't about ethics. It was about survival. Still, they weren't done yet. The chandlers adapted by branding their candles as cleaner, purer, more spiritual. Beeswax candles were promoted heavily in churches. Tallow makers improved their processing methods, reducing smoke and making the burn steadier. But the winds had already changed. The guild that refused to die despite the threats, the worshipful company of wax chandlers, and the tallow chandlers' company both survived the transition. They doubled down on their traditions, ceremonies, apprenticeships, wardenships, and scrolls of old rules. In the 1600s, these guilds became as much ceremonial as practical. They threw feasts, attended mayoral events, and held processions through London. Being a chandler was still an honor, even if oil lamps had begun to edge them out of everyday use. Some towns supported the guilds with subsidies, keeping the candle trade alive for public rituals, processions, and royal anniversaries. But the shift was clear. Candles were no longer the primary light source. They were accessories. Interestingly, in places where whale oil was scarce or expensive, like parts of the Scottish Highlands or inland Germany, the chandlers held on longer. Their craft survived in monasteries, village fairs, and small-scale markets, mostly ignored by the march of oil and innovation. But a bigger change was coming, and this time, it sparked like flint. Enter the age of gaslight in 1807. London's Pall Mall was lit by gas for the first time. It was a modest street, chosen for its proximity to royal institutions and its frequent foot traffic. But it marked a milestone. Gas lighting was powerful. It lit entire streets, courtyards, factories. Suddenly, a flickering candle seemed laughably inefficient. By the mid-1800s, most major cities in Europe had begun replacing public lighting with gas. For chandlers, this was devastating. Municipal contracts dried up. Churches reduced orders. Even middle-class homes, which once lit dozens of candles nightly, switched to wall-mounted gas jets. They hissed rather than flickered, but they burned reliably and cheaply. Candle making, once a pillar of urban infrastructure, was now artisanal. From function to symbol by the late 19th century, candles had shifted almost entirely from practical objects to symbolic ones. They burned in cathedrals, certainly, but also in birthday cakes, at funerals, during romantic dinners, or in ceremonial processions. The candle's light came to represent warmth, remembrance, solemnity, not everyday necessity. Some former chandlers transitioned into perfumed candle making, adding scents, experimenting with shapes, embedding flower petals or lace. It was no longer about survival. It was about aesthetic. Ironically, the craft that began as a means to combat darkness had now entered the light of leisure. The final records, the worshipful company of wax chandlers, still exists today. So does the Tallow Chandlers Company. Their modern role is largely philanthropic and ceremonial. They award scholarships, support trades, and preserve the ancient customs of the candle guilds. Their archives are extensive. Shelves of vellum-bound ledgers, candle-size regulations, apprentice contracts from the 1300s. These records, once dull administration, are now treasures of historical insight. In one such ledger from 1441, a complaint is recorded. The tallow of Brother Peter's batch was of such stench that it drew mice even from the baker's house. That's history too. A candle's quiet. Echo today, you can walk into any boutique store and buy a candle with hand-dipped wicks, beeswax from a local farm, and packaging that boasts traditionally made. It might cost $25 and sit next to a display of herbal teas, but within that candle is a ghost of the guilds. The long hours, the burnt fingers, the stinky tallow, the union meetings held by candlelight, the apprentices who whispered about better wages, the widows who carved saints into wax, the wardens who tapped defective candles with a brass rod and sighed. They may be forgotten in the big picture, overshadowed by wars and kings, but their work mattered. Every flickering light you see in a chapel, every candlelit dinner, carries their legacy. Not all labor needs to be dramatic to shape the world. It is a warm morning in Athens, sometime in the 4th century BCE. You are not famous. You are not a statesman, or a general, or even particularly clever. You are Nicias, son of no one important, wearer of one good sandal and one with a broken strap. You live 3 streets from the agora, you rent a tiny room above a potter's shop, and you have absolutely no plans for the day. Today is your day off. There's no trial to attend, no debts to settle, no shipment of amphorae to unload. You woke up with the sun, rolled over, and ate a handful of last night's olives from a clay bowl. One of them had a small worm in it. You didn't mind. It was soft. The birds outside are louder than usual, but otherwise, nothing's happening, and that's the plan. You step into the alley with the intention of doing absolutely nothing, as thoroughly and with as much commitment as possible. But before you make it even 3 steps, you hear your name. Nicias. It's Thales, your neighbor, a man with a belly like a well-fed goat and the patience of a man who argues for fun. He waves you over. "What are you doing?" he asks. "Nothing," you say. "Perfect," he says. "I'm arguing with myself and losing. Join me." You sit beside him on the low wall that divides your street from the shade of a fig tree. It's not even really a wall, just a stone with delusions of grandeur. "I maintain," Thales says, "that olives are fruit." "They are," you reply. He looks scandalized. "That's not the point." You wait. "They are technically fruit," he continues, "but they are spiritually closer to meat. Think about it. Hearty, salty, satisfying. And they fill the stomach with something like regret." You shrug. "So do half the women in the agora." He laughs so hard he spills his morning wine. The 2 of you sit in the sun, arguing gently about olives for the better part of an hour. You conclude they're probably gods who chose a humble form. He insists they're punishment for hubris. You wowish both agree they're better with cheese. Eventually you stretch your legs and say, "I should move." "Why?" "My sandals stuck to the stone." "Leave it. Sandals are temporary. Feet are eternal." You leave it. You walk barefoot down the slope toward the marketplace. It's already filling with voices, sellers, philosophers, donkeys. A child runs past carrying a chicken. No one chases her. You assume this means the chicken is hers now? You buy a sesame cake from a stall you've never seen before. The seller says it's her grandmother's recipe. You believe her. The cake tastes like sugar, dust, and ancient revenge. You sit on the steps of the stoa and eat slowly. Across the square, a group of students is gathered around an old man with a scroll. He's waving it in the air and shouting about the definition of virtue. You listen for a moment. He uses the word form 5 times in one sentence. You lose interest. Back near the edge of the market, an old woman is selling ceramic fish that serve no purpose. You buy one. Why? Because she looks like your aunt, and the fish has a crooked smile. You name it Pythagoras. You carry it with you the rest of the day. Eventually, you wind back to your alley. The fig tree has dropped 2 leaves. Thales is asleep now, snoring gently, head resting against the wall. You sit beside him, fish in lap, 1 foot bare, the other covered in sesame crumbs. And you realize nothing happened today. You didn't solve a problem. You didn't deliver a message. You didn't even finish your cake. But you watched the light change on the stones. You argued about olives. You named a ceramic fish. And as the wind shifts and a dog barks somewhere near the Acropolis, you think, maybe the soul also needs days when nothing happens, so it remembers what it means to simply be. The next morning, you wake to the sound of a broom. A soft, steady sweep, like someone trying to erase footsteps from stone. You sit up, blink, and peer over the edge of your sleeping mat. Light spills through the window in ribbons. It's another warm day. You check the floor for spiders, stretch your arms, and whisper a greeting to the ceramic fish you bought yesterday. "Good morning, Pythagoras," you say. "We still have nothing to do." He does not reply, but you feel his crooked ceramic smile judging you anyway. You descend the stairs and find that your other sandal, once abandoned, is now gone entirely. Either someone stole it or the fig tree ate it. You do not investigate. Outside, Thales is already sitting on the wall, but this time he's holding a broom. You pause. "Are you ill?" He shakes his head. "Volunteered to sweep the temple steps." You stare. "Why?" "Priest said the crows won't come anymore. Said it's because the dust has offended Apollo." You wait a moment. "And you believed him?" "No, but I wanted to see if crows have taste." He hands you a second broom. You don't remember agreeing to help, but your hand closes around the handle anyway. The 2 of you walk slowly through the streets toward the temple. You pass early risers, stray dogs, and 2 men arguing about whose goat produced the saltier milk. You wonder briefly what sort of life leads to that argument. At the foot of the temple of Apollo Petrus, you find the steps covered in fine yellow dust. The kind of dust that settles after a long dry spell. The kind of dust that remembers feet. Thales takes the left. You take the right. You begin to sweep. It's not difficult work, but it has a strange rhythm. Long strokes, short ones, tapping the bristles clean against the marble. After a while it becomes meditative. 2 priests watch from the shade. One nods once. The other yawns so deeply his hat slips. You pause for water halfway through and watch a crow land on the roof. It doesn't seem offended. It caws once, then begins pecking at something shiny in the gutter. A second crow joins it. You point. Thales grins. They have returned. Clearly your sweeping was holy. "I'm not surprised," he says. "I have very devout elbows." You finish the last few steps. A boy walks past, trips, and spills a basket of figs across the stone. You wait for him to cry. He doesn't. He just gathers the figs and offers you one. You eat it. It's sour but generous. Back in the shade, the priest finally speaks. "You may leave the brooms," he says. "May we be paid in wisdom?" Thales asks. "No. You leave anyway. It's midday now." You walk slowly down the colonnade. the sun warming your shoulders. You pass a pottery stall where a woman is carving patterns into a water jug. You stop to watch. Her hands are steady, patient. You don't say a word, but she nods to you. At the agora, a street performer is balancing a lyre on his foot while whistling. No one claps. You do. He bows extravagantly. You end up near the river by late afternoon. The water is low. Children are throwing stones into a shallow pool. One of them aims for a floating sandal. You recognize it. Yours. You do not retrieve it. You sit by the bank, feet in the cool water, ceramic fish in your lap. Pythagoras, still, hasn't spoken. You admire that about him. Thales joins you, handing you a folded leaf with cheese inside. You eat in silence. Do you think we accomplished something today? He asks. I think we removed dirt that will return tomorrow. He nods. So, a success. You watch the crows circling the temple roof in the distance. They came back. They never left, he says. They were waiting for us to look up. You sit together as the sun lowers and the shadows stretch. The figs are long gone. The lyre player has disappeared. But the dust, you suspect, has already begun to return. And as the breeze stirs the reeds and the clouds curl like sleeping cats above the hills, you think, maybe nothing days aren't empty at all. Maybe they are simply full of the things we usually forget to notice. The third day begins with a grape to the forehead. You're not entirely sure where it came from, only that it was hurled with intent and considerable speed. It bounces off your brow with a soft thump, lands in your lap, and rolls to the ground. You blink. Across the alley, a child grins. That was my breakfast, you say. She shrugs and runs off. You decide to take this as a blessing. A free grape is a free grape. You pop it into your mouth. It's sweet, slightly wrinkled, and tastes like a reward for surviving a quiet week. You stretch your arms, greet the morning air, and retrieve your ceramic fish from its perch by the window. Another day of nothing, Pythagoras. He continues to disapprove silently. Outside, the alley smells of crushed thyme and last night's cooking fires. A man is repairing a sandal using only thread, patience, and what appears to be a chicken bone. You nod to him. He nods back. You wander toward the agora, barefoot again, one toe bandaged from yesterday's heroic decision to walk across sun-baked stones without flinching. You flinched. A lot. Near the market's edge, a group of older men sits in a loose semicircle. One of them waves you over. You know them only by nicknames: Potbelly, Eyebrows, and the one who sneezes in fives. None of them remember your name, and you've never bothered to remind them. Today's argument is about whether or not shadows have weight. Eyebrows insists they must. If they don't, how come you can feel cooler in one? Potbelly counters. That's not weight. That's absence. You sit quietly and listen. No one wins, no one ever does, but that's not the point. At midday, you walk to the olive grove just beyond the city wall. It's empty except for a goat chewing on a robe sleeve and a man asleep under a tree. You lie, down in the shade nearby, placing your ceramic fish on your chest like an honorary shield. You nap. When you wake, a fig has fallen beside you. You eat it without sitting up. The man under the other tree is now awake, carving something into the dirt with a stick. You watch without asking questions. It looks like a boat, or maybe a fish, or maybe a very confident cloud. He hums a tune you almost remember. You stay a little longer than you should. The light begins to soften, the breeze cools, and the birds begin their pre-evening rituals of judging everything that moves. You wander back into the city, past a group of girls skipping rope with vines, past the potter's boy, who is now covered entirely in red clay. You stop by your neighbor's wall and see Thales again, this time holding a scroll and a cup of watered wine. He offers neither. He simply says, "You missed the baker's cat giving birth." To kittens? No. To small gods. Probably kittens. You nod. I had a fig. Fair trade. You sit with him as the sun begins to dip. The air turns gold. Dust curls lazily in the breeze. Somewhere, someone sings out of tune. It's perfect. You take a long sip of wine and lean your head back against the wall. I've done nothing for 3 days, you say aloud. Thales grins. And yet you're still here. I'm starting to think that's the whole point. He lifts his cup. To the point then, you clink your clay cup against his. Later, just before dark, you return to your room. You light a small lamp, not because you need it, but because it feels wrong to sit in the dark just yet. You place your ceramic fish on the table beside a few coins, a pebble shaped like a nose, and a folded fig leaf that may or may not be a bookmark. You exhale. And as the shadows stretch long across the floor and the crickets begin their slow chorus of reminders, you think, maybe the best kind of day is the one where you remember how to sit still, how to breathe, and how to let the world move without asking it to mean anything. You are standing at the edge of a muddy stream somewhere on the outskirts of York. The year is 1371. It's not quite dawn, and the world smells faintly of wet wool, wood smoke, and old soap. Your hands are already half numb from the cold water, but you keep scrubbing, a steady rhythm that beats through the silence like a kind of morning prayer. Welcome to the day-to-day life of a medieval laundress. She is not a noblewoman. She is not a nun. She is not even a servant in a great house. She is something else entirely, part tradeswoman, part laborer, part town gossip, and entirely essential to the rhythm of medieval society. Her work is invisible, constant, and, for centuries, taken entirely for granted. But without her, the streets would smell worse, the linen would rot, and a good deal of reputation would be lost. The sudsy social fabric laundresses in medieval England were often independent. They were usually poor, usually women, and always busy. They worked from home or, more often, from the stream banks just outside town walls, hauling linens, chemises, cloaks, and coifs in great bundles. Laundry wasn't a daily or even weekly activity for most medieval people. It was seasonal. Clothes were worn until they smelled too strongly to ignore, or until a festival or Sunday forced a refresh. Underclothes got the most attention, especially among wealthier households who might own more than one change of linen. But for the common people, linen was precious and washing it was a minor ordeal. So when it had to be done, it was done all, at once, and it was done thoroughly. Enter the laundress, her tools, lye soap, ash-based cleansers, sometimes stale urine, yes, really, and a thick washing bat. Her workspace? The cold river or stream, a flat stone surface, and maybe a rope for drying, strung between low trees or fence posts. Starting before the sun. The laundress's day began early. She had to beat the other women to the water to claim a good spot. A place with firm footing, a decent current, and a little privacy was prized. She'd haul her washing tub, wooden and worn, and her supplies down the dirt paths before the cock crowed. First came the sorting. Whites in one pile, everything else in another. Anything stained with bodily fluids, common among childbirth. Linens, infirmary bedding, or garments from sick houses required special handling. Next came the soaking. Items were soaked overnight or dunked repeatedly in the morning to loosen grime. Then came the scrub. Soap or ash was applied, stains were scrubbed with stones or brushes, and garments were pounded against rocks to loosen dirt. This wasn't delicate work. It was loud, repetitive, and often backbreaking. The sound of bat against stone echoed like a drum roll down the stream, a rhythm shared by laundresses across the countryside. Reputation on the line clean linen wasn't just a comfort. It was social currency. In towns where everyone could smell everyone else, cleanliness made a statement. A housewife with spotless sleeves and a husband in clean hose earned respect. A man with wine-stained cuffs or greasy collars could quickly become a target for gossip. This gave laundresses a surprising amount of social power. They saw the under things. They knew who had blood-stained sheets, who sent garments more often than they should, and who suddenly stopped sending anything at all. They noticed when a merchant's cloak came back with a new perfume, or when a nobleman's bedding arrived with burns from a candle too close to comfort. Of course, most laundresses kept these things to themselves, at least for a price. A coin here, a loaf of bread there, occasionally a favor. But others? Well, they were known to whisper at the taverns, and yet they remained in demand. Dirty linen didn't clean itself. The smell of lye and labor soap, when available, was handmade. The recipe? Boiled animal fat, water and lye, produced from wood ash and rainwater. It was harsh on the hands and left behind a bitter smell, but it worked. Some laundresses made their own soap. Others bought it in chunks from traveling merchants or at town markets. If times were tight, they'd use stale urine, a centuries-old trick for removing tough stains and brightening whites. The smell? Pungent, but effective. After scrubbing came rinsing. Several passes in clean water, wringing the fabric by hand and laying it out to dry. Clothes were never hung in neat rows as they are today. They were draped over bushes, laid across flat stones, or pinned to makeshift lines with carved wooden pegs. As the garments dried, the laundress could finally rest, but only briefly. The drying process had to be watched carefully. Rain could ruin a full day's labor. So could thieving hands or wandering dogs looking for something to chew. The weight of water-wet linen is heavy. A full day's work could easily involve lifting and wringing 8,100 pounds of sodden cloth. Add to that the tubs, tools, and the walk to and from the river, sometimes more than a mile, and the physical toll becomes clearer. But what was the alternative? Washing clothes inside the home was discouraged. It took up space, created dampness that damaged timber and thatch, and produced odors that lingered for days. For most, outsourcing laundry was not luxury. It was survival, laws, fines, and laundry. Gossip. Like most trades in medieval towns, laundry had rules. Some cities required laundresses to register. Others banned them from washing in certain rivers, particularly during Lent or holy days, when modesty was more strictly enforced. In Paris, laundresses were fined for letting clothes float downstream or for dumping dirty water too close to the main roads. In York, a 14th century city ordinance declared that no woman was to wash linen where the town's pigs drink, a rule that had less to do with hygiene and more to do with the complaints of local butchers. But rules didn't stop the trade. If anything, they made it more formal. Some laundresses began forming loose cooperatives, informal unions that pooled resources, protected turf, and shared drying areas. They didn't call them guilds, but in spirit, they served the same function. Their work was invisible in records, but their absence would have been noticed, and loudly. So as the sun finally climbed over the treetops and the mist rose from the water, the laundress dipped one more chemise into the river and wrung it with practiced grace. There was still more to clean, and a life beyond the washing tubs. But how did these women navigate illness, clients, and competition when the river wasn't kind? By late morning, the riverbanks grew busier. Children wandered down with buckets. Other women came to scrub wool or wash vegetables. And sometimes, a man would appear with a basket of soiled linens and an awkward smile. He wouldn't stay long. This was a laundress's domain, part workplace, part social theater, part sacred trust. Laundry may seem like a mundane task, but for 14th century laundresses, it was anything but. Beneath the surface of suds and stained tunics ran deeper concerns: infection, reputation, territory, and the subtle but ever-present fear of becoming invisible. The infirmary bundle one of the most dreaded jobs was cleaning cloth from the sick room. Medieval medicine had no concept of microbes, but people understood that illness clung to cloth. The sheets of the feverish, the undergarments of the wounded, and the rags used in birthing chambers were treated with suspicion and care. Hospitals, or what passed for them, often had their own washers, but poorhouses, monasteries, and households hired laundresses to deal with the aftermath of illness. They arrived with bundles tied tight, cloth already stiff from dried fluids. To wash these linens, laundresses used stronger lye soap or soaked them longer in ash water or urine. Sometimes they sprinkled sage or rosemary over the drying cloth in hopes of warding off bad humors. Superstition blended with sanitation, though neither guaranteed safety. There are records from Bruges, circa 1378, of 3 laundresses dying within a month after washing plague-soaked bedding. Their deaths weren't blamed on infection, of course, but on foul airs and contact with devil-sick cloth. Some towns even prohibited washing plague linens in public waterways. Yet many women still did it. They needed the coin, and someone had to carry the filth away. The rivalries of the river. With few formal guilds, laundresses depended on relationships, and occasionally rivalries, to carve out their space. Good washing spots were prized. So were loyal clients. It wasn't uncommon for disputes to arise. A laundress might accuse another of stealing a client's shift. Another might allege that a competitor deliberately soiled a drying cloth with soot. In York, records show fines levied on women for fighting with washing sticks or throwing lye into a neighbor's bucket. These weren't petty brawls. A laundress's ability to secure work was tied to her spot on the riverbank and her reliability. A single accusation of cloth thinning, scrubbing too hard and damaging fabric, could ruin her reputation. So could gossip. To defend their names, some laundresses began sewing unique colored threads into the corners of clients' garments, a quiet early form of branding. Others developed signature knots for how they tied finished bundles. These small, silent signals helped distinguish honest workers from pretenders. It was business, but it was also survival. Water, faith, and filth. Religious orders relied heavily on laundresses. Monasteries outsourced laundry during busy feast cycles or when monks fell ill. Some nunneries employed women regularly, paying them in food or candles instead of coin. And because many laundresses worked near sacred sites, abbey rivers, holy wells, they developed a strange spiritual relationship with the water. In parts of Wales and northern England, it was customary to whisper a prayer before wringing out the first piece of cloth each morning. "Let sin go with the soil," one saying went. Another, older one simply stated, "As the thread is rinsed, so rinse my name." Some carried small tokens, a saint's medallion, a wax seal, a carved wooden comb, tied into their aprons for luck. Saint Hannah, a noblewoman who washed the clothes of the poor, was later named patron saint of laundresses. She was rarely painted, with a halo. More often, she carried a tub. Still, for many women, faith and washing were linked not just in symbol but in rhythm. The repeated wringing, soaking, scrubbing, it resembled penance, or perhaps prayer. Children and the laundry line laundresses were often single mothers or widows. Those who had children brought them along to the river, tying infants to their backs or letting toddlers splash nearby in shallow puddles. Older children helped by turning bundles or laying cloth to dry. Laundry became a family trade by necessity, but it wasn't without hazard. Fast-moving streams, shifting stones, and slippery banks led to frequent accidents. Parish records from Norfolk mention several water-crippled children, those who slipped near washing sites and were left with lasting injuries. Still, few alternatives existed. Childcare was unpaid. Laundry was not. When the river froze, winter posed a unique challenge. Rivers froze, hands chapped, soap lost its softness, and drying took twice as long. Some laundresses retreated indoors, hanging lines inside barns or by hearths. But smoke blackened the fabric, and drying took days. Others used warmed stones to press out moisture or beat cloth dry against flat timbers. They'd wear layers of wool soaked in goose fat to keep their arms from cracking in the cold. Yet winter laundry was in high demand. Christmas feasts, end-of-year confessions, and cold weather illnesses all brought more linens to wash. Some women made a year's worth of income between December and February. By necessity, they adapted. They had to. And in adapting, they honed. Techniques passed down from mother to daughter, not in books, but in bruised hands and whispered wisdom. Payment, barter, and the coinless economy. Many laundresses were paid in goods rather than money. A morning's washing might earn a loaf of bread, a joint of salted pork, a hunk of cheese, or a few eggs. Coin was better, of course. It allowed them to buy soap or firewood. But food was rarely refused. Some clients brought extras to curry favor, a silk ribbon for a daughter, a wool hood for cold mornings. These tokens built loyalty. A laundress who was well-fed in winter remembered her clients come spring. And in poorer areas, where coins were rare and cloth even rarer, laundry became a kind of underground economy. Women traded wash loads with midwives, bartered soap with bakers, and built social safety nets entirely apart from official oversight. It was never stable, but it was theirs. The disappearing names. Despite their importance, few laundresses left. Records. They appear in fines, ledgers, and sometimes in court cases, but rarely in chronicles. Their names, when recorded, were listed as Agnes the Washer or Joan of the Water. Not surnames, just functions. Their stories lived in oral tradition in the shape of a wooden tub passed down, or a patch of riverbank referred to as Meg's Bend. The rise of laundries, larger, often male-owned washing businesses that began in the 15th century, began to push individual laundresses aside. Regulation increased, fees were added, and slowly, the small-time washerwomen, who once owned their trade, began to disappear from records entirely, but not before leaving stains of history behind, faint but permanent. So as the bells ring for vespers and the riverbank empties, a laundress gathers her tools and hauls her final bundle over her shoulder. Tomorrow will be another day of soaked hands, whispered stories, and the scent of ash and cloth. But what did the end of this trade look like? And who came to replace her? It's the mid-15th century now, and the old riverbank is quieter. The same spot that once echoed with bat strikes and laughter is still wet with tidewater, but the sounds are different. Less rhythm, more rumble. A cart clatters by on the nearby road. Somewhere in town, a new kind of business is opening its doors. The commercial laundry. The days of the independent laundress are fading. But like all things in history, it didn't end with a bang. It ended slowly, linen by linen, rule by rule, until the personal art of laundry was boxed, labeled, and monetized. A trade once ruled by strong-backed women and whispered secrets would soon become part of the new urban machine. The rise of the steam. Wash by the late 1400s and into the 1500s, wealthier cities in Europe saw the rise of organized wash houses, public facilities designed for the laborious task of laundering on a larger scale. They were sometimes funded by monasteries, sometimes by municipalities, and sometimes by entrepreneurs who saw a business opportunity in soap and steam. These facilities weren't mechanical, not yet, but they offered roofed washing areas, heated water tanks, and central drying spaces. For the first time, laundry could be a profession run on a schedule, managed with receipts, and scaled for entire neighborhoods. For independent laundresses, it was both a relief and a threat. Some were hired on as workers in these early laundries. Others were squeezed out. The freedom to choose your own clients, your own riverbank, and your own hours began to disappear. replaced by shift work, overseers, and rigid rules. In Paris, for example, the 1530 city statutes banned freelance washing along the Seine within city limits. Only registered laundries could operate legally. Anyone else caught with bundles was fined or had their cloth seized. The laundress, once queen of her stretch of river, was now just another employee. The gender shift. Interestingly, as laundering became more commercialized, more men entered the profession, particularly in urban centers. Male supervisors began managing laundries, especially those serving aristocratic households or military camps. They controlled the hiring, pay, and distribution of work. While women still made up the vast majority of workers, their autonomy shrank. Decisions were made further up the chain, far from the river's edge. Some resisted. In Ghent and Cologne, groups of washerwomen protested wage cuts and demanded the right to keep personal clients outside their work contracts. These actions rarely made the records, but in a few court rolls from 1552, we read of women who struck their masters with buckets or refused to labor in the wet rooms. Resistance, small and soggy, continued. The laundry token economy. With commercial laundries came another innovation, the token system. Clients who dropped off clothes received small carved discs, often wooden or metal, stamped with a number or emblem. When they returned, they presented the token and received their cleaned garments. It was simple, efficient, and deeply impersonal. For laundresses who once knew every stitch of a client's life, from the scent of their bedding to the burn marks on their cuffs, this system felt alien, but it worked. In busy cities, tokens reduced confusion. They also made it easier for laundry owners to scale their business and employ dozens of anonymous workers. The laundress's personal touch, once her signature, was no longer needed. The smell of clean changed soap also changed. By the 1600s, soap making had become its own regulated trade. Marseille, Venice, and London became major soap-producing hubs. No longer made in back kitchens or sold in fist-sized lumps at the market, soap now came in wrapped bars with city seals, regulated weights, and sometimes even scent additives. The smell of clean shifted, from sharp lye and fat to lavender, lemon, or rose. Laundresses, many of whom still made their own soap for home clients, found themselves priced out. Their old tricks, urine brightening, ash soaking, herbal scenting, were now viewed as outdated, even uncivilized. Customers began to ask for French soap or new process washing. Progress smelled sweet, but it left the riverbank behind. The last bundles by the 1700s in most major cities, the independent laundress was a rare sight. She existed in the countryside, still hauling bundles over muddy fields. She showed up in church ledgers as a one-off hire. She appeared in diaries, usually mentioned only when she failed to deliver on time. But she was no longer a public figure, no longer a force. In her place stood laundries with timetables, fees, foremen, and branded linen bags. The profession had survived, but the woman who built it, owned it, and carried it through plagues and frost and flood had been gently pushed out. And yet, echoes remained. Some families held on to their washer, a trusted woman who had cleaned their linens for decades. Some villages passed down tricks, how to soak cabbage leaves for stain removal, or how to dry cloth without warping its grain. And some laundresses, aging and arthritic, handed their tubs and soap molds to daughters who no longer needed them. They left no monuments, but they left memory. Laundry as lore in folklore, laundresses remained. French ghost tales warned of the lavandière, ghostly washerwomen who beat cursed sheets under moonlight, punishing liars and oath-breakers. In Irish legend, the bean, Nye was seen washing bloodied clothes by rivers, an omen of death. Even in legend, the laundress was linked to the fabric of life, birth, sickness, death. Her labor was sacred because it was constant. And long after she vanished from the stream banks, her image endured in paintings, songs, and sayings. In rural Spain, it was said, "You know the truth like a washer knows a stain." In England, trust a midwife, doubt a monk, and always pay your washer. A modern glimpse today, when we toss a shirt into a machine, we rarely think of the hands that once labored over it. Hands wrinkled from cold water, red from lye, stiff from wringing. But that machine, humming in your home or basement laundrette, is the end of a long, wet road. A road paved by thousands of women who, with no machines, no protections, and little praise, scrubbed the sweat and filth from medieval life. They didn't do it for gratitude. They did it because someone had to. And in doing so, they kept homes respectable, hospitals bearable, and festivals presentable. So next time you fold a fresh pillowcase or catch the scent of lavender detergent, remember the women at the riverbank. They're still there, somewhere in history, wringing, rinsing, and watching the clouds for rain. Imagine walking into a tailor's stall in 17th century Istanbul. The scents of dyed cloth, beeswax polish, and spiced tea fill the air. Robes in deep indigo and ochre line the walls. On the work table lies a small tray, not of gemstones but of buttons. Bone, brass, mother of pearl, even carved wood. You point to a modest set of toggles, but the tailor gently leans in and whispers something strange. "Are you sure, my friend? Buttons are taxed this season." Thus begins one of history's more peculiar fiscal experiments. The Ottoman button tax, a tax not on land, not on salt or grain or gold, but on how you fastened your shirt. Dressing the empire to understand why this odd levy existed, you have to understand Ottoman dress. The empire was vast and diverse, stretching from Hungary to Yemen, from the Balkans to Baghdad. But despite its size, Ottoman dress codes were surprisingly specific. Robes, caftans, sashes, turbans, and slippers were more than fashion. They were symbols of status, religion, and profession. Tailors played a central role in reinforcing this visual hierarchy. So did fasteners. Buttons, toggles, ties, loops, all communicated something. The wealthy wore buttons of silver or coral. Courtiers often had decorative toggles hand-stitched by apprentices. Religious scholars favored more conservative closures, simple ties of linen or silk, designed not to call attention, but for the state, buttons held a different kind of value. They were taxable. An empire of taxes. The Ottomans were master administrators. Their tax systems were intricate and often localized, adjusted based on region, crop yields, trade routes, or even fashion trends. A robe sold in Edirne might be taxed differently than the same robe in Damascus. Taxes were also often itemized, in excruciating detail. There were taxes on blacksmith tools, on camel hire, on imported saffron, on barrels of olives, and yes, even on the number and type of buttons sewn onto clothing. Why? Because buttons, small as they were, indicated affluence. The logic was simple. If you could afford decorative fasteners, you could afford to pay a little more. Thus was born the Dume Resmi, the button levy. How the button tax worked it wasn't a tax on loose buttons sold in stalls. It applied to finished garments. Tailors were required to declare the number and material of fasteners used in a robe or tunic. The information was recorded, and a small charge was added to the final sale. Pennies by today's standards, but meaningful to those buying clothes on a tight budget. The tax only applied to garments with more than a certain number of fasteners. For example, up to 3 buttons, nice untaxed 4, 6 buttons, when taxed at half rate 7+ buttons, at full rate buttons made of precious metal. Extra charge. Tailors often stitched decorative buttons without functional purpose, just to convey status. These too were taxed. Inspectors known as elchi defterchisi, messenger recorders, were sometimes dispatched to market stalls to perform random checks. This led to a cottage industry of tax tricks, hiding extra fasteners inside linings using disguised toggles made of cord or fabric declaring dual-button closures as single ones. And yet, despite the grumbling, the tax persisted. Tailor tensions and silent protests, tailors were not happy. Some petitioned the local Qadi, Islamic judge, to reduce or remove the levy. Others formed informal agreements to underreport button counts for loyal clients. A few even offered button rebates, slightly overcharging for the robe, then refunding the button tax in secret. But open defiance was rare. Ottoman record-keeping was relentless, and tax evasion carried stiff penalties, ranging from fines to temporary confiscation of goods, and in extreme cases, public shaming in the market square. Still, there were murmurs. In Bursa, a tailor reportedly sewed 8 buttons onto a robe but tied 3 together with thread to claim it only had 5. In Aleppo, inspectors began checking not just the front of garments, but sleeves and inner linings for hidden toggles. And in Istanbul, one shop was fined after a robe was discovered to have decorative buttons on the back, purely ornamental, but taxable nonetheless. These stories may sound absurd now, but for the people who lived them, they were part of a larger truth. Every stitch mattered. Cultural impact and consumer behavior, as with most taxes, people adapted. Shoppers began favoring garments with ties, loops, or sashes. Tied closures were often seen as more modest and escaped the button tax altogether. Designers responded with new patterns, robes that wrapped and tied rather than buttoned, sleeves stitched shut to avoid fasteners, collars that slipped over the head. In this way, a minor tax changed fashion. Wealthy citizens, of course, ignored the inconvenience. Some flaunted their fasteners, donning coats with rows of silver buttons or ornamental closures shaped like pomegranates. But for the working classes, simplicity became stylish. One-button dignity, a saying went, is cheaper to wear than 7-button pride. Historians even speculate that the rise of loose-fitting Ottoman outerwear was accelerated in part by this very tax. Robes with fewer closures were easier to make, more comfortable in warm climates, and most importantly, cheaper. At checkout buttons beyond borders by the 18th century, the button tax had evolved. It was merged into broader luxury taxes, no longer collected as a separate fee. But its legacy lingered. In the provinces, particularly the Balkans and Anatolia, tailors remembered. Oral traditions mentioned the button counter, a figure, both feared and mocked. Some children's rhymes even referenced button tax collectors. 1, 2, 3 on the vest. Hide the 4th, or pay the rest. Other empires experimented with similar levies, sometimes on lace, tassels, or dyes. But the Ottoman button tax remains one of the clearest examples of fiscal policy shaping literal fashion. As trade expanded, and as European-style coats with rows of buttons became popular, Ottoman tailors found ways to balance tradition with modernity. Double-breasted jackets appeared, with one row of buttons purely decorative. Did those count as taxable? Only the inspector knew. But what does it mean when a tax on something as small as a button affects how millions dress? The afternoon sun bakes the stone courtyard of an Istanbul market. Peddlers fan themselves under striped awnings. A tailor, his robe loose, his eyes alert, spots something across the crowd. A man in an olive-green kaftan, clutching a small notebook and wearing a sash with the Sultan's tugra embroidered in gold thread. An inspector. The tailor sighs, quickly runs a hand down the front of the garment on his display stand, and counts, quietly, just to be sure. 1, 2, 3, no more than 5. It's a game played in silence across the empire. The tailoring class adjusting their craft not for comfort or beauty, but for compliance. This is the world the button tax created. A strange ecosystem of creative sewing, cautious, selling and fiscal bureaucracy that touched every level of Ottoman life, from palace fashion to the poorest robes on a shoemaker's back. The inspector's notebook button tax enforcement was managed by a small bureaucratic niche within the Ottoman revenue system, often referred to as Dume Defterçiliği, roughly button registry record keeping. These officials, usually educated scribes, received training in materials, tailoring techniques, and common fraud methods. Their task? To assess garments in markets and tailor shops, and determine whether the fasteners used warranted taxation. Each inspector carried a ledger, an eski kayıt defteri, with columns for location, seller, button count, material, and tariff charged. They weren't allowed to open bundles or invade homes, but they could inspect anything on display or actively being sold. Shops were expected to cooperate or risk fines. Despite the seriousness of their work, inspectors were often mocked. Quietly, of course. In Bursa, they were nicknamed Düğme Avcısı, button hunters. Satirical poems described them as men who measured shirts like goats, counted threads like coins, and frowned at fabric like a jilted lover. But tailors respected them, or at least feared them. A mark in the wrong column could result in confiscated stock, a steep fine, or a mandatory closure for a market day. Creative tailoring. Workarounds, as the tax endured, tailors began to adapt, sometimes with quiet rebellion, sometimes with full-blown ingenuity. The decoy button. Some tailors sewed buttons only through the outer fabric of a robe, with no corresponding loop or hole. These floating buttons appeared functional, but were purely decorative. Arguably, they didn't qualify as closures and were often overlooked by sympathetic inspectors. Buttonless wraps. Designs changed to favor wrap robes tied with cords, belts, or sashes. These closures were stylish, adjustable, and, critically, untaxed. Some became signature looks, particularly among scholars and poets. The button stack. In wealthier circles, tailors sometimes stacked multiple buttons in vertical rows, but only one was truly functional. The rest were sewn shut. This preserved the appearance of luxury without incurring the full tax rate. Reversible robes. A small number of elite tailors began crafting reversible garments. If inspected, a robe could be flipped to its plain side, hiding ornamental buttons or decorative stitching. One court case in Aleppo documents such a robe being turned inside out by the merchant upon the inspector's approach. These methods weren't just clever. They were necessary for survival in a trade squeezed by policy. Class enclosure. The button tax became a quiet marker of class. A robe with many buttons announced a person's wealth, not just because the garment was expensive, but because they could afford the tax attached to it. Thus, in the minds of many, Ottomans' buttons became a form of wearable currency. An imam might choose a robe with loops and sashes to signal humility. A merchant might wear a simple tunic to avoid suspicion. A high-ranking courtier, however, would wear buttons not despite the tax, but because of it. To be taxed was a privilege, a kind of conspicuous compliance. Tailors had to know their clients. Nobles wanted flash. Scholars wanted subtlety. Soldiers needed functionality. And the middle class, ever anxious, needed plausible deniability. If a robe was stopped and taxed, the tailor could be blamed. But if it was plain and untaxed, the client might be accused of stinginess. Some tailors kept two registers, one for the client, one for the inspector. Quiet arithmetic ensured both parties were satisfied. Interregional variations. Because the Ottoman Empire was so vast, implementation varied by region. In the Balkans, where colder climates encouraged layered garments, the tax was often reduced to avoid deterring local wool production. In Damascus, where silk robes were popular among traders, silk loop closures became widespread to avoid taxation on pearl buttons. In Egypt, a brief rebellion by Cairo's tailors in the early 1700s saw the suspension of the button tax for 2 years, before it quietly resumed in a reduced form. Some provinces ignored the rule altogether. Records from rural Anatolia suggest that small towns often saw no inspectors for years. There, tailors continued to sew as they pleased, and buttons flourished. But in urban centers, particularly Istanbul, Edirne, and Smyrna, the rule remained firm. It was a symbol of control, and in the heart of the empire, symbols mattered. Religious exceptions. Interestingly, religious garments were not entirely exempt from the tax, but they were treated with more nuance. Imams and dervishes who wore garments with hidden closures were often not taxed. Monks of certain Orthodox Christian orders had exemptions written into local codes, particularly if their garments were handmade or imported under waqf, charitable trust, provisions. Jewish tailors in Thessaloniki sometimes negotiated bulk waivers for ceremonial robes, arguing that decorative fasteners were part of sacred tradition. In most cases, these requests were granted, provided the garments were not resold. Thus, while the rule was widespread, it was flexible. And in that flexibility lived the long, slow negotiation between state and subject. The administrative machine by the 18th century, the button tax had become entangled in the larger system of tekalif-i-urfiye, customary taxes imposed by the Sultanate. It was no longer itemized on ledgers, but bundled with fabric tariffs, dye import fees, and tailoring licenses. Inspectors still existed, but they now reported to broader tax bureaus. Their notes were archived, rarely read again unless a dispute arose. Some tailors missed the old ways. At least then, one wrote in a letter dated 1734, we knew what we were paying for. Now the taxes come in threes, and no one can count the buttons. But there was a growing sense that the age of fastener oversight was ending. New clothes came with new rules, and new rulers came with new priorities. Still, one question lingered. If buttons were once taxed as a luxury, what would happen when they became so common no one even noticed them? The year is 1820. Ottoman Istanbul is humming with change. The streets are fuller, the coffee houses louder, and the robes brighter, more European in cut, more flamboyant in detail. Somewhere, in the back room of a once busy tailor's shop, a wooden tray of buttons sits untouched. Mother-of-pearl discs, brass toggles, bone-carved fasteners, all arranged in neat little rows, quietly collecting dust. The tailor hasn't restocked them in months. He doesn't need to. The button tax, once recorded with ink and scrutiny, enforced by inspectors and whispered about in back alleys, has slipped silently into disuse. No proclamation, no announcement, just silence. Fading into fabric. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman button tax had been effectively absorbed into broader textile tariffs and tailoring fees. Urban guilds had either disbanded or been folded into more centralized administrative structures. The Dume Defterçisi, once a fixture in the markets, had been reassigned or dismissed entirely. Garments changed, too. The robes of previous centuries, loose, flowing, layered, gave way to fitted coats and trousers influenced by European styles. The French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and expanding global trade brought not only new political ideologies, but also new tailoring expectations. And with those expectations came buttons, dozens of them. Gone were the subtle loops and quiet ties of traditional Ottoman dress. Instead, coats now sported symmetrical rows of fasteners. Shirts had buttoned cuffs and collars. Even boots sometimes bore decorative buttons along their sides. The state didn't fight it. By then, it had other problems. The Tanzimat reforms and the shift in priorities. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Ottoman Empire launched the Tanzimat reforms, sweeping modernizations meant to centralize authority, streamline taxation, and encourage industrial growth. Under this agenda, quirky taxes like the button levy became irrelevant. Instead, the state focused on railroads, factories, and standardized codes. Taxes were codified into official ledgers, issued by uniformed officers rather than local guild scribes. And while some nostalgic clerks may have remembered the button tax, it had no place in the new system. The empire had outgrown it, but fashion had not. The button's golden age. By the mid-19th century, buttons became more than fasteners. They were fashion statements. Factories in Britain and France mass-produced them in horn, shell, metal, and early plastic compounds. Catalogs advertised entire sets by color and material. Ottoman tailors, adapting to these trends, began buying buttons in bulk from Europe. Some even ordered bespoke pieces with family crests or store emblems. The irony? What had once been a heavily monitored detail, measured, taxed, and debated, was now decoration. The button had become affordable, abundant, and oddly anonymous. No one counted them anymore. And yet their history lingered in language and legend. Lingering traces in folk. Memory old tailors still told stories. In Bursa and Edirne, retired craftsmen recalled the days when inspectors would measure sleeves and count fasteners by candlelight. Some kept framed copies of old button tax forms, yellowed with age. Children's rhymes remained too. Don't sew too many down the chest, or the man with the pen will do the rest. And in a few provincial workshops, apprentices were still warned not to waste buttons, lest the empire wake up and charge for them again. It never did. But the warnings remained. Buttons in religious and political dress. Interestingly, even as civilian clothing embraced the button, religious attire continued to resist it. Imams, monks, and dervishes preferred robes tied at the waist, fastened with cord or layered without closure. To them, the button represented excess, vanity, or simply European imitation. Some scholars saw in the rise of buttons a symbol of Western influence and its consequences. One dervish in a 19th century letter referred to buttons as silver, fleas cluttering the breast, distracting from humility. Others embraced them as part of a changing world. Even in politics, button counts played a role. When ambassadors visited European courts, their uniforms were carefully tailored to match Western standards. They bore rows of polished buttons, not for function, but diplomacy. The old question of how many is too many now belonged not to the inspector, but to the image makers of empire. The buttonless resistance. Not everyone joined the trend. In rural Anatolia and the highlands of Bosnia, many communities continued wearing traditional garments well into the 20th century. Tunics were tied, cloaks were pinned, fasteners were rare. For them, the button was a city thing, a symbol of Istanbul and all its bureaucracy. In some villages, elders refused to wear buttoned garments, even when gifted them. "Why would I fasten myself to someone else's fashion?" one proverb asked. In this way, the legacy of the button tax lived on, not in law, but in the quiet resistance of local tradition. A stitch in empire. So what do we make of it all? A tax on buttons sounds absurd today. And yet it offers a unique lens into the daily life, bureaucracy, and psychology of an empire. It reminds us that power is not only wielded in palaces or courts. Sometimes it lives in seams and stitches. The button tax shaped how garments were made, how tailors adapted, how clients dressed, and how the state understood control. It influenced class distinction, religious dress, and even fashion aesthetics. And when it faded, it left behind more than silence. It left behind a buttoned world. You may never look at your shirt cuffs the same way again. The air is thick with mist as you drift across a narrow canal, somewhere in the Valley of Mexico in the year 1450. The canoe glides silently between rows of lush green growth, corn, squash, beans, even flowers blooming in bright explosions of color. You smell wet earth, hear the soft slap of water against wooden poles, and watch as a man balances on the edge of an earthen platform, dropping a fishing line into the canal while pulling weeds from the soil beneath his feet. This is no ordinary farm. This is a chinampa. And the man, he's not just a farmer. He's part engineer, part horticulturist, part environmentalist, and one of the unsung architects of one of the world's most impressive pre-modern agricultural systems. Welcome to the floating farms of the Aztecs. A city in a lake to understand. The Chinampas, we must first understand the city that relied on them. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was built on a series of islands in Lake Texcoco. Founded in 1325, it grew into a city of canals, causeways, and dazzling temples. But while its military and political power get all the historical attention, its survival and its people's nutrition depended on something far more practical: food. Feeding a city of up to 200,000 people required more than conquest. It required an agricultural system adapted to the watery, marshy environment of central Mexico. And that's where the Chinampas came in, building a floating garden. The word chinampa roughly means square made of reeds, but in truth, each one was a marvel of sustainable engineering. To create a chinampa, Aztec farmers began by staking out a rectangular plot in shallow lake water, often near the edges of islands or riverbanks. They drove long wooden poles into the lakebed to define the space, then wove mats of reeds and branches between them to create a sort of underwater fence. Next came the layers, mud dredged from the lakebed, decaying vegetation, and more reeds. This mixture was piled inside the staked rectangle, slowly forming a raised platform just above the waterline. The result? A rich, spongy patch of earth, floating atop the water, infused with nutrients and moisture from below. But it wasn't just the soil that was brilliant. Farmers planted ahuejote trees, fast-growing willows, along the edges of each chinampa. Their roots stabilized the structure, their branches shaded crops, and their presence formed natural windbreaks. Over time, these islands became almost indistinguishable from solid land. Except, they were better than land. The miracle of moisture. Because chinampas sat in the lake, water was never far from the root systems. This allowed for nearly year-round growing, a rarity in pre-modern agriculture. Most chinampas could produce up to 7 harvests a year. Maize, beans, amaranth, chilies, tomatoes, and squash thrived in the damp, rich soil. So did herbs and medicinal plants. Even more remarkable, the very act of dredging the lake to build chinampas helped deepen the canals, improving canoe traffic, and reducing flooding in the city. It was a self-reinforcing system, and it was quiet. No beasts of burden churned the soil. No irrigation ditches needed to be dug. Just canoes gliding silently between rows of plants, carrying farmers with baskets, tools, and bundles of food. This silence, broken only by birds and paddles, was the heartbeat of Tenochtitlan. Daily life. On the Chinampas, a typical day for a chinampero, the farmer who worked these plots, began before dawn. He or she, because women also worked these farms, would paddle out in a canoe loaded with tools: a wooden digging stick, a flat-bladed coat laxopo for slicing through roots, and a curved basket for harvesting. Farmers tended to multiple plots, sometimes passed down for generations, each marked by tree groupings or carved stones. They rotated crops, harvested continuously, and pruned weeds by hand. Pest control came in the form of frogs, birds, and clever companion planting. Certain flowers were grown specifically to repel insects. Fish traps lined the canals. Ducks and frogs were also caught and eaten. Occasionally, water snakes were collected, not for food but for ceremonial uses. Children learned the system early. Boys practiced paddling and planting beans, while girls helped gather herbs and sort maize, kernels. The work was steady, rhythmic, and embedded in ritual. Offerings were made to Tlaloc, the rain god, and to Xochipilli, patron of flowers and fertility. Small bundles of seeds or maize dough were placed under stones at planting time, an ancient insurance policy against drought or disease. A floating world within a city. Chinampas weren't just outlying farms, they were part of the city itself. The Xochimilco and Tlahuac regions, still famous for their canals today, were dotted with hundreds of these floating plots. Even central Tenochtitlan had smaller chinampas woven between neighborhoods. Market days saw canoes packed with produce glide into the city's heart. Goods were sorted by type. One dock for maize, another for flowers, another for fish. Everything moved efficiently. No beasts of burden needed, no wheels clogging roads. The calm waters created a peaceful infrastructure. And at its peak, this system may have supported over 5,000 acres of chinampas, feeding hundreds of thousands. The genius lay not in one invention, but in an ecology of understanding, of land, water, weather, and work. But what happens when that balance is disrupted? What if conquest, disease, and colonial ambition threaten to drain not just the lake, but the knowledge it carried? It is the early 1520s. Spanish ships cast shadows over the waters of Lake Texcoco. The once proud city of Tenochtitlan shudders under the weight of steel, cannon smoke, and unfamiliar horses. And yet, beyond the smoke and rubble, the chinampas still float. For a brief, silent moment, they endure. But the world around them is changing fast, and the floating gardens of the Valley of Mexico, once the lifeblood of an empire, are about to face their greatest trial. Not flood or famine, but foreign policy and urban expansion. The arrival of the Spanish, when Hernán Cortés and his men marched into the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were astonished by what they saw. The city of Tenochtitlan, with its canals and gardens, its organized markets and clean streets, stood in stark contrast to the towns of Europe. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés' army, wrote of gardens that seemed to float upon the water and farmers who glided like ghosts between crops in canoes. At first, the chinampas were spared. The Spanish needed food. They needed vegetables, herbs, and the knowledge of the local people to survive. Many chinamperos, reeling from disease, war, and forced conversions, continued farming as best they could. But within a few years, things began to shift. The draining of the valley. The Spanish viewed the lakes of the Valley of Mexico as a threat. Unlike the Aztecs, who adapted to water, the Spaniards feared it. Flooding in 1555 devastated the rebuilt colonial city of Mexico City, built atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, and officials began devising ways to drain the lakes permanently. Their goal: convert the region into land that could be controlled with European-style roads, carts, and settlements. And so began the great drainage projects. Over the next centuries, engineers dug canals, built tunnels, and constructed levees. The waters of Lake Texcoco were steadily lowered, diverted, and dried. This process, spanning over 300 years, reduced the lake to a fraction of its former size. As the water vanished, so too did the chinampas. The survivors of Xochimilco yet not. All was lost. In the southern region of Xochimilco, far enough from the political core of colonial Mexico City, the chinampa system survived, at least in part. Here, indigenous farmers continued their traditions, adapting as best they could. Many worked for colonial landlords but kept small plots for themselves. They taught their children the same layering of soil and vegetation. They passed down seed-saving methods, water management practices, and planting calendars rooted in the Tonalpohualli, the ancient Aztec calendar. Spanish authorities taxed their crops, forced conversions, and occasionally seized lands. But in the furrows between willow trees and floating footpaths, a quiet resistance took root. The floating gardens lived on, not as state infrastructure, but as cultural memory, seeds of syncretism. Over time, the Chinampa system absorbed Spanish elements. Crops like wheat, onions, and even grapevines were introduced alongside maize and squash. Christian saints' days replaced traditional festivals, but the rhythm of planting and harvesting stayed the same. Some farmers began offering flowers to the Virgin of Guadalupe instead of Xochipilli. Others whispered old prayers under their breath while crossing themselves in front of their plots. This blending wasn't submission, it was survival, and it helped protect the Chinampas through centuries of colonial upheaval. The fight for recognition. The 18th and 19th centuries, the Chinampa system was no longer central to Mexico's food production. Industrial agriculture, land privatization, and the continued draining of the valley pushed floating farming to the margins. But in Xochimilco and Tláhuac, the gardens remained. Locals began to advocate for their cultural and ecological value. In the early 1900s, anthropologists began studying Chinampas as relics of primitive ingenuity. This patronizing view helped preserve some of the canals, but failed to recognize the living knowledge of the communities who still worked them. Worse, urban expansion crept closer. Roads, railways, and sewage systems threatened the remaining plots. Some canals were filled in. Others became clogged with debris. Still, the farmers, now proudly calling themselves Chinampeños, adapted. They began growing ornamental flowers for the capital's markets. Marigolds, dahlias, and roses filled their plots, especially around Day of the Dead, when flower sales soared. By doing so, they found a new way to make the Chinampas profitable, visible, and, most importantly, worth preserving. Canoes and resistance. In the 1970s and 80s, with pollution rising and canals shrinking, local leaders began organizing. They lobbied the government for environmental protections, formed cooperatives, and educated tourists about the system's heritage. UNESCO declared Xochimilco a World Heritage Site in 1987. It helped, but challenges remained. Water shortages, invasive species, garbage, and unchecked tourism. Still, the Chinampeños persisted. They used canoes instead of motorboats. They built nurseries to grow native plants and fight erosion. They taught school children how to build a chinampa from scratch. And some began experimenting with organic certification, hoping to market their vegetables to eco-conscious buyers in Mexico City. Their message was simple. This isn't nostalgia, it's a future. But can floating farms truly survive in a city of 20 million? You step into a canoe, its worn wooden hull creaking slightly beneath your feet. It's early morning in modern-day Xochimilco, and the water is still. Mists curl over the canal's surface. The city buzzes distantly like a memory rather than a presence. In the air, the scent of moist earth, of marigolds, of something old and quietly enduring. Around you, the chinampas stretch out, some abandoned, others lush with crops and flowers. This isn't a relic. It's a living system, older than the Spanish conquest, older than many empires. And though it has faded from central agricultural relevance, it continues to whisper its wisdom into the future. You're not looking at ruins. You're looking at resilience. A fragile continuation today, only a fraction of the original Chinampa system remains, perhaps 2,000 hectares, scattered around the Xochimilco and Tláhuac regions. And yet, these surviving plots still function, much as they did 500 years ago. Farmers dredge mud from the canals, layer organic material, and plant maize, amaranth, spinach, and herbs. They rotate crops, prune by hand, and paddle gently from one plot to another. Some still plant willows to secure their plot edges. Others anchor their chinampas with sandbags or stone, adapting to the city's changed hydrology. No tractors, no artificial irrigation, just sun, water, and centuries of inherited technique. But the challenges are real. Polluted runoff from Mexico City's sprawl seeps into the canals. Invasive species like tilapia and water hyacinth choke waterways. And land pressure, ever present, in one of the world's largest cities, threatens to erase the last remnants of this unique system. Still, there is movement, and it's not just backward-looking preservation. It's forward-thinking revival. The Chinampa, as climate solution. In recent years, researchers and environmentalists have taken a renewed interest in the Chinampa system, not as heritage, but as innovation. Chinampas require no synthetic fertilizer. Their closed-loop design regenerates soil with canal sediment and organic waste. They retain water during droughts and absorb floodwaters during storms. They sequester carbon in both crops and sediment. And they foster biodiversity, supporting birds, amphibians, and native plants. In short, Chinampas are a model of regenerative agriculture. As climate change accelerates and megacities face increasing food insecurity, the floating farms of Xochimilco offer quiet lessons in sustainability. Researchers from the UN and Mexican universities are studying how the system could be replicated or adapted for use in flood-prone urban areas around the world. Could Jakarta benefit from Chinampa-inspired plots? Could parts of Bangladesh? Could the Amazon? Questions once dismissed as quaint are now urgent. The return of the canoe farmer. Alongside scientific interest, cultural movements are growing too. Young Chinampeños, many the grandchildren of farmers who abandoned the plots in the mid-20th century, are returning. They're reviving techniques, experimenting with heirloom seeds, and selling directly to markets and restaurants in Mexico City. Some sell organic produce to high-end chefs. Others run community-supported agriculture, CSA boxes for eco-conscious locals. A few offer guided tours or workshops, teaching city children how to plant maize in the mud of their ancestors. These aren't reenactments. They're revolutions, slow, muddy, but rooted. And they carry something rare in the modern world, agricultural memory that never died. Between tourism and tradition. Of course, Xochimilco is also famous for something else. Trajineras, the brightly painted gondola-like boats that carry tourists down the canals to the sound of mariachi bands and clinking bottles. Tourism has been both a blessing and a burden. It brings money and visibility, but it also introduces trash, noise, and canal damage. Farmers sometimes find styrofoam in their spinach beds. Canal walls crumble from motorboat wakes. The peace required to tend a chinampa, never hurried, never loud, can be hard to find among party barges. Efforts are underway to balance the two worlds. Some chinampa cooperatives now offer quiet zone eco-tours. Others work with local schools to raise awareness about farming heritage. In some areas, floating signs in the canals ask visitors to respect the crops. This water feeds the soil. The fact that such signs are needed says a lot, but so does the fact that someone took the time to make them. A living map of survival Chinampas are more than farms. They're records. Each plot holds layers of soil, seeds, and sediment that speak to centuries of human adaptation. Archaeologists have studied pollen samples from Chinampa beds that date back 700 years. They've found trace remains of cacao, chili, squash, and maize, and even tools made of obsidian and bone. One researcher likened the Chinampa to a living book. Each root system is a sentence. Each canal is a paragraph. To erase the system would be to burn a library. And so, farmers, scientists, teachers, and families keep tending, reading, and adding to that library. Not out of nostalgia, but because it still works. Reflections in still water. So what can a muddy, floating rectangle teach us in the age of climate breakdown and concrete? That growing food doesn't have to harm the land. That human settlement doesn't have to erase ecosystems. That cities can be built with water, not against it. And that somewhere, in a quiet pocket of the world's third-largest metropolis, a 700-year-old farming technique continues. Resilient, flexible, and gently productive. No plows, no pipelines, just poles, trees, seeds, and patience. You watch as a man stoops to tend to a row of herbs. He wipes his hands on his tunic, picks up a fishing line, and hums something old and untranslatable. Around him, the Chinampa floats, rooted in nothing, grounded in everything. A system that rose with an empire, endured through its fall, and keeps feeding the world in ways we're only now beginning to understand. You're standing barefoot on smooth marble tiles, your skin prickling from the warmth of rising steam. The air is thick, almost musical, with the distant sounds of trickling fountains, whispered conversations, and the faint splash of water. The walls are painted with faded gods and dolphins. Your hand trails along a fluted column slick with condensation. A servant passes, offering oil for your skin. Welcome to the Thermae, a Roman public bath. But beware, this is not a free-for-all spa. You're expected to know the rules, even if they're never written. The Roman bathhouse was as much a civic institution as a hygiene facility, and beneath its tiled surface ran layers of unspoken etiquette, quiet hierarchies, and occasionally fragrant disputes. Let's begin with a wash. More than cleanliness. In the Roman world, public baths weren't just about hygiene. They were about being Roman. The typical Roman bath complex was vast. The larger imperial thermae, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, sprawled over acres and included libraries, gardens, gymnasiums, snack counters, and lecture halls. But even small-town bathhouses followed a familiar pattern. Apoditerium, changing room, tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot room, and frigidarium, cold plunge. For just a small fee, or none at all, if subsidized, you could pass through these stations in a sequence designed to open the pores, soothe the muscles, and encourage conversation. It was a daily ritual, often done after midday work and before the evening meal. But participation wasn't just about preference. In some cities, not visiting the baths regularly was considered uncivilized. Employers expected their staff to be clean. Clients judged business partners by their grooming. And philosophers, even the famously frugal ones, debated the correct way to soap one's back. A person might skip dinner. They wouldn't skip the baths. Step 1. Undress, but not carelessly. Upon entering the apoditerium, you'd find niches for storing clothes, benches to sit upon, and often a servant or two to assist with sandals and tunics. Most Romans wore little, under their togas, perhaps a loincloth or nothing at all. So this first step was both intimate and performative. Stolen clothing was a real concern. Graffiti from Pompeii warns bathers not to trust their sandals to strangers. Wealthier patrons hired capsarii, locker attendants, to guard their belongings. Others used long pegs driven into the walls, tying a cloth bundle with cord and sealing it with a personal knot. There were rules here too. Do not loiter while undressing. It blocked traffic. Do not comment on others' garments or physique. Do not use someone else's oil flask without permission. And never, ever take the corner bench unless invited. It was traditionally reserved for older men or magistrates. The tepid approach to conversation. From the changing room, you'd step into the tepidarium, the warm antechamber designed to gently raise your body temperature. Here, conversations began. Friends greeted one another. Strangers exchanged pleasantries. Deals were whispered. Poems were recited. It was not uncommon to hear debates on politics, military campaigns, or the latest philosophical scandal, all spoken softly through the steam. Silence was respected, but not expected. Still, raising your voice too much was considered poor form. You were also expected to observe a few courtesies. Do not interrupt someone already engaged in conversation. Do not comment on another's choice of oil or scent. Do not speak of bowel, troubles or fungal remedies in a warm room. The tepidarium was a place of warming, both of the body and of the mood. It prepared you for the plunge ahead. Into the caldarium. The caldarium was the hottest room, a chamber filled with rising steam, heated floors, and a large basin or pool of hot water. Here things got sweatier, slipperier, and more intimate. It was also where social boundaries could blur. Senators bathed next to bakers. Slaves oiled the backs of minor officials. Philosophers scraped grime from the skin of their students with strigils, curved metal tools used to remove oil, dirt, and sweat. But there were unwritten rules, and plenty of them. Do not enter the basin before rinsing off first. Do not splash others unless invited. If someone drops a strigil, retrieve it with the handle, never the blade. Do not engage in loud laughter or horseplay near the water. And curiously, do not bring garlic into the caldarium. The heat made it smell unbearable. Some bathhouses enforced quiet codes of rank. Wealthier patrons used higher benches, closer to the source of the steam. Others sat near vents for cooler air. Regulars often had their favorite spots. Taking someone's usual seat could spark a minor war, but the most sacred rule of the caldarium? Respect the silence of sweat. Some Romans believed that the room's heat sweated out not just bodily toxins, but bad humors and negative thoughts. Disturbing that process was, in some circles, practically sacrilegious. The scrape and the soap after steaming came scraping. Bathers oiled themselves, olive oil being the most common, and then scraped it off with the strigil. This removed dirt, dead skin, and excess oil. For many, this step was as important as the bathing itself. Some hired attendants to perform the scrape. Others did it for each other. A famous graffiti line reads, "Lucius scraped me well today. Tomorrow he owes me wine." Rules for scraping were specific. Never borrow a strigil without permission. Always heat the oil gently. Cold oil was thought to stiffen the joints. Scrape toward the heart, not away from it, though modern anatomy might disagree. And if you scraped someone else's back, you were expected to return the favor, or offer a small coin in thanks. Even this, a moment of grooming, was a tiny act of economic exchange. Time to cool. After heat came cold. The frigidarium was a plunge pool of cold water, usually in a vaulted room with mosaic floors and high ceilings. Some skipped it. Others insisted it closed the pores and sealed in the virtues of the bath. It was also, strategically, the final step before dressing. Clean, cool, and lightly perfumed, you'd pass back through the apoditerium, retrieve your tunic, and re-enter the world. You had been seen, cleaned, and socially reintroduced. But not everyone belonged equally. In this watery world, who could visit the baths? Who was barred? And what happened when the unwritten rules were broken? The sunlight filters through stained glass above the bathhouse courtyard. Olive trees cast shadows on mosaic tiles, and somewhere nearby a man shouts in frustration, "He's been denied entry to the frigidarium." The reason? He insulted the capsarius yesterday and left without paying for his oil. It's a reminder, the Roman baths were public, yes, but not without boundaries. They welcomed all classes, but they also sorted them. They relaxed the body, but they also enforced unspoken codes of behavior, status, and morality. And when those codes were violated, by accident or design, the baths could become places of exclusion, embarrassment, or even scandal. Who could bathe? In theory, Roman public baths were open to everyone. Men and women, free and enslaved, patrician and plebeian. Each could, at some point in the day, enter the complex and partake in its rituals. Entry fees were minimal, sometimes waived entirely. especially under generous emperors. And there were no official dress codes, because in most areas, bathers were nude or nearly so. But in practice, certain limitations applied. Time-based separation. Most bathhouses practiced gender segregation, though not always via separate facilities. Instead, men and women were often assigned different hours. Men typically bathed in the late afternoon. Women, if allowed, bathed in the mornings. Some bathhouses had separate wings. Others converted spaces midday. In smaller towns, arrangements were more flexible, especially for families or festivals. Slaves and attendants. Slaves could bathe if permitted by their masters. Often they accompanied their owners, carrying towels, scraping tools, and oil flasks. Some even bathed while their masters met clients or debated politics in the tepidarium. But slaves knew their place. They did not sit near officials. They did not speak unless spoken to, and they exited quietly. Children and the elderly. Children were allowed but watched. Too much noise, splashing, or running could result in expulsion. Or worse, a reprimand from a stern elder with a strigil and no sense of humor. Elderly patrons, by contrast, were often shown deference. Certain bathhouses even reserved warm benches near the furnace for older citizens. The sick and the cursed. While public health was a nebulous concept in Roman times, some patrons with visible illnesses, especially skin conditions, were discouraged or outright banned. Superstition played a role here. Warts, boils, or strange rashes were seen as signs of divine disfavor. There are reports of bathers crossing themselves, or the Roman equivalent, clutching amulets, when seated near someone with the mark of Mars. And yet, certain temples, adjacent to baths, welcomed the sick, blurring the line between cure and contamination. The quiet surveillance bathhouses had no formal police, but enforcement was constant, through gossip, peer pressure, and the ever-present eye of the capsarius, or bath attendant. These men weren't guards, but they remembered faces. They knew who tipped, who lingered too long, who scuffed the mosaics with hobnailed sandals. They could make or break a patron's reputation with a raised eyebrow or well-timed cough. Attendants also kept the peace. If a disagreement arose over seating, oil, or cue positions, they might intervene, sometimes with a word, sometimes with a shove. A man from Pompeii was famously banned from his local bathhouse after spitting oil into the water basin. His name was carved into the door lintel, a permanent reminder of poor form. Moral panic and the bath says, with any institution that welcomed both the powerful and the powerless, Roman baths were frequent sites of moral debate. Writers like Seneca, Pliny the Elder, and Martial all had opinions. Some praised the baths as bastions of Roman civilization. Others decried them as cesspools of vanity and decadence. Martial wrote poems mocking men who preened in the steam rooms, wearing too much scent or practicing speeches in front of the mirrors. Seneca, ever the Stoic, warned that too much bathing weakened the moral fiber. He argued that Roman virtue lay not in rose-scented oil, but in self-discipline and cool water. Juvenal, sharper still, implied that bathhouses encouraged unnatural behaviors, by which he meant flirtation, gossip, and soft living. But despite the noise, Romans kept bathing. Even emperors did. The imperial splash Roman emperors used bathhouses as both relaxation and political theater. Hadrian bathed publicly, often without bodyguards, to reinforce his image as primus inter pares, the first, among equals. Marcus Aurelius is said to have composed parts of his meditations between steam sessions. Caracalla constructed one of the grandest bath complexes in Rome, complete with gilded ceilings, imported marble, and room for 6,000 patrons a day. These were not just buildings. They were messages. "I am clean," they said. "I am Roman, and so are you." But emperors weren't immune to the bathhouse's codes. One anecdote tells of Emperor Commodus, who tried to wrestle a famed athlete in the Palaestra, the wrestling court attached to many baths, and was promptly thrown to the ground. The athlete was later executed, but not before becoming a legend of bathside gossip. When things went wrong, bathhouses weren't always peaceful. Arguments over stolen oil flasks, flirtation with someone else's spouse, or seating disputes could turn violent. Fights broke out in the tepidarium. Insults flew in the frigidarium. And occasionally, someone drowned in a cold plunge after too much wine. One tablet inscription from Ostia records an apology. I, Lucius, regret the throwing of the strigil at Marcus, and offer this towel in peace. In more serious cases, magistrates might be summoned. Fines were levied. Repeat offenders were banned. But most problems resolved themselves through custom, apology, or gentle exclusion. Class, cleanliness, and the fine line. The baths may have been democratic, but not equal. Wealthier citizens arrived with servants, scented oils, and private towels. They tipped well and received better treatment. Poorer citizens borrowed tools or went without. Their tunics were older, their sandals cracked, their coins fewer. Still, they were welcomed, because at the core of the Roman bath system was a shared understanding that everyone, regardless of status, should be clean, presentable, and included. It was, in a way, the Roman ideal made warm and wet. But what happens when that ideal is challenged by the rise of Christianity, the collapse of infrastructure, and the slow crumbling of empire? The baths are quieter now. It's the 5th century CE. The caldarium no longer hums with conversation. The marble floors are cracked. Vines creep in through once-stained glass windows. The air still carries the ghost of steam, but the heat has faded. Outside, the empire teeters on the edge of collapse. Barbarian invasions, economic instability, religious transformation. Each has chipped away at the grand institutions of Roman life. And the public bathhouse, once a symbol of unity, hygiene, and leisure, has become a relic of an earlier age. But how did such a central feature of daily life disappear? And what remains in its absence? The early signs of decay. By the late 300s, CE cracks, both literal and metaphorical, began to show in the world of Roman bathing. Economic troubles. Maintaining a large bathhouse was expensive. Fuel had to be gathered, mostly wood, sometimes coal. Water pumped or carried in. Attendants paid, tiles repaired, fires stoked day and night. In the golden years of empire, emperors and local elites funded these costs willingly. But as Romans, finances declined, so did subsidies. Wealthy patrons died or fled. Cities shrank. And with them, so too did the daily maintenance of the thermae. Fewer baths were cleaned. Fewer boilers were fired. Some baths began closing rooms. Others reduced hours. Eventually, entire wings were shuttered. Cracks went unrepaired. Water shortages. The famed aqueducts that fed Rome and its provinces required constant upkeep. When invasions or civil wars disrupted labor and governance, those water systems fell into disrepair. With lower water flow came stagnant pools, reduced sanitation, and, eventually, the closure of entire facilities. The loss of urban density. The Roman bathhouse thrived in cities. But as the empire contracted, many urban centers depopulated. Without a concentrated base of patrons, the bathhouse lost its relevance. Why heat a caldarium if only 5 men attend? In the countryside, simpler bathing practices took over. Small pools, household tubs, river washing. But the most transformative change wasn't logistical. It was ideological. Christian conversion and cultural reversal as Christianity spread throughout the Roman world. New attitudes toward the body, modesty, and public life began to influence bathing culture. Early Christian leaders were divided on the issue. Some, like Tertullian, condemned the baths as dens of vanity and temptation. Others, like Clement of Alexandria, permitted bathing but discouraged excess and mixed gender attendance. Eventually, the moral consensus shifted. Nudity, once normalized in the Roman baths, was now increasingly taboo. Segregation by sex became stricter. Bathhouses were rebranded as places of potential sin rather than civic virtue. In some areas, Christian leaders banned clergy from bathing in public altogether. In others, churches built their own small, regulated baths, but never at the scale or frequency of Roman times. Where emperors once funded sprawling thermae, bishops now funded baptistries. The ritual of washing didn't disappear. It changed purpose. The last fires go out. By the 6th century CE, most major public baths in the Western Roman Empire had ceased functioning. In Rome itself, the baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, once wonders of the world, fell into quiet decay. Some cities, the ruins became animal pens or marketplaces. Others were stripped for stone, their marble shipped off to build churches and fortresses. But in the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, the tradition lingered. The Byzantines maintained public baths into the 9th and 10th centuries. These balneae were smaller, more austere, and increasingly private. The core ritual remained: heat, oil, scrape, cold. But the scale and symbolism changed. Eventually, even these began to fade. And in their place came a new tradition. From Roman steam to Islamic hammam, when Arab Muslim forces expanded into former Roman territories in the 7th and 8th centuries, they encountered bathhouses, some abandoned, some functional. Rather than reject them, they adapted them. The Islamic hammam borrowed much from Roman and Byzantine baths: multi-room designs, temperature, gradation, marble floors, and oil scraping. But it introduced new rituals: prayer washing, stricter gender separation, and enhanced privacy. In cities like Damascus, Cairo, and later Istanbul, the hammam flourished, proof that the Roman philosophy of cleansing, relaxation, and social bathing still held appeal even under different theologies. In a way, the Roman bathhouse lived on, just not in Rome. The archaeology of soap and silence today, Roman baths remain among the most studied ruins in the world. Archaeologists have uncovered soap trays, oil flasks, discarded strigils, mosaic warning signs, no urinating in the basin, and plumbing systems more sophisticated than some 19th century cities. In Pompeii, one bathhouse's wall still bears the scratchings of a tired patron. "I am clean, and the world is not, but I shall return tomorrow." And in places like Bath, in England, Arles, in France, and Trier, in Germany, ancient thermae have been partially restored, offering tourists a sanitized glimpse into the past. But the full experience, the sound of voices in mist, the politics of bench placement, the etiquette of towel sharing, has faded. Still, echoes remain. Lessons from the steam. The Roman bathhouse wasn't just about water. It was about structure. It created a daily rhythm of care, community, and cleansing. It reminded citizens that the body mattered, not just in health, but in presence, and that hygiene wasn't personal. It was civic. Today, we bathe in solitude. We step into showers, close doors, turn knobs. Efficiency replaces ritual. But perhaps there is something to remember in the warm mist of those vanished halls. That cleanliness once meant connection. That conversation once came with steam. That even an empire at its most polished began and ended with the quiet scrape of a strigil on skin. Imagine the village of Salins-les-Bains in 16th century France. The air smells of brine and wood smoke. Men and women work by salt pans, boiling brackish water in large iron cauldrons over roaring fires. The labor is hard, the reward precious. Salt is more than seasoning. It is survival, preservation, currency, and symbol. Welcome to the world of the gabelle, France's infamous salt tax, and the centuries-long tension it wrought between crown and commoner. Salt's importance was profound. Without it, food spoiled quickly. Salted meat, fish, and cheese were lifelines through winters and wars. Salt was a public good and a state monopoly. But with monopoly came control, and control bred resentment. The birth of a burden. The gabelle was first established in the 14th century, but grew in scope during the Renaissance and early modern period. It was not simply a tax, but a system. Certain regions were required to buy a fixed amount of salt at inflated prices. Others were exempt or paid less. Salt was controlled tightly. It was illegal to produce, buy, or sell salt outside royal channels. Smuggling was common and harshly punished. The state taxed salt to fill its coffers for wars, royal courts, and infrastructure. But it taxed all levels of society, from wealthy merchants to poor peasants, disproportionately. The salt monopoly was deeply unpopular, not just for its cost, but for how it symbolized distant, extractive royal authority. A patchwork of privilege and pain France was divided into zones regarding salt. The Pays de Grande Gabelle, where salt was most heavily taxed and strictly controlled. The Pays de Petite Gabelle, with lighter taxes. Pays exempts, where salt was free or lightly taxed. This patchwork created disparities that caused confusion, unfairness, and friction. Villagers near border zones would sometimes buy salt in cheaper areas, smuggle it across, or trade illicitly. This salt became contraband, known as faux saunier salt. The crown responded with courts, patrols, and harsh punishments, including public flogging, brandings, and imprisonment. But salt remained essential. Salt in daily life and culture. Salt wasn't just food. It was medicine, ritual, and social marker. Wives sprinkled salt on new marriages for fertility. Farmers salted seeds to cleanse them. Travelers carried salt sachets for purification. Linguistically, salt symbolized worth and friendship. The French phrase être du sel means to be lively or witty, an acknowledgement of salt's cultural flavor. But the tax meant that for many, salt was rationed, precious, and sometimes stolen. The seeds of quiet rebellion. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, small-scale salt smuggling became a common form of resistance. Faux sauniers, smugglers and counterfeiters, organized intricate networks to evade tax collectors. Women often played critical roles, hiding salt in clothing or baskets of laundry. Children acted as messengers. These acts weren't grand revolutions. They were survival. And yet, the gabelle became a symbol of royal oppression, one that would feed larger unrest. What did this salt tax mean for ordinary lives? For family meals, village economies, and the simmering anger before revolution. The morning fog clings low to the forests of the Loire Valley. A group of villagers gather in, whispers passing small white parcels wrapped tightly in cloth. Their destination? The nearest town, where salt can only be bought at prices they cannot afford. These are the faux sauniers, salt smugglers, and their story is one of quiet courage, ingenuity, and the stubborn will of ordinary people caught beneath the heavy hand of the gabelle. The smuggling network. Salt smuggling wasn't a lone venture. It was organized. Villages in tax-heavy regions developed clandestine routes, secret hiding places, and coded messages. Smugglers used forests, rivers, and mountains passes to move their precious cargo. Sometimes they disguised salt as coal or grain. Other times, it was hidden in false bottoms of carts. Women played key roles. Their baskets, laden with laundry or produce, provided cover. Children acted as lookouts or messengers, slipping unnoticed, through village streets. Despite the danger, fines, imprisonment, even whipping. Many risked the journey. Salt was essential, and the gabelle was unjust. Patrols and punishment. Royal patrols, known as gabelus, were tasked with enforcing the salt monopoly. They patrolled roads, markets, and borders, searching for contraband salt. Their reputation was feared. Villagers spoke of brutal searches, random arrests, and public punishments designed to intimidate. Yet gabelus were often locals themselves, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes corrupt. There are records of officers turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes or favors. This complicated enforcement. Smugglers became adept at spotting patrol patterns, avoiding checkpoints, and sometimes negotiating safe passage. The economy of salt was woven into every aspect of rural economies. Farmers salted pork and fish to survive winter. Bakers needed salt for bread. Winemakers used it in barrels. Markets relied on salted goods. When salt prices rose, everything else rose too. Villagers shared stories of meals ruined by insufficient salt, or of children suffering from scurvy-like symptoms, an unfortunate consequence of poor nutrition and scarce seasoning. Salt shortages sparked local tensions and occasional riots. These were rarely about salt alone. They were about dignity, survival, and justice. Community and conspiracy. Smuggling created unexpected solidarity. Communities protected smugglers. They shared in profits, warned each other of patrols, and cared for those caught or injured. Songs and stories celebrated the cleverness of the faux saunier. One popular ballad tells of a mother who hid salt in her child's diapers, evading searchers. Despite harsh penalties, the salt trade flourished underground. Salt and the road to revolution. The gabelle became a focal point of anger during the decades, leading to the French Revolution. Philosophers and pamphleteers railed against it as an emblem of royal tyranny and inequality. Common folk saw it as a tax that touched every meal and every moment. In some regions, salt smugglers became folk heroes. The tax's abolition in 1790 was hailed as a victory. Yet echoes of the gabelle lingered in France's relationship with taxation, state control, and popular resistance. Salt, in the end, was never just salt. What happened when the gabelle was gone? And what did it teach about the power of a pinch of seasoning? The year is 1790. The French Revolution is reshaping the nation. The gabelle, the hated salt tax that once filled royal coffers and fueled secret economies, has finally been abolished. For millions, salt is suddenly cheaper, freer, and seemingly less, a tool of oppression. But the end of the gabelle was not the end of salt's story. Salt, after the tax removing the tax, did more than lighten household budgets. It transformed social relations and state power. Where once the crown controlled salt as a monopoly, now salt markets opened up. Small producers, artisans, and merchants could trade salt freely. Rural communities gained autonomy over their resources. Salt, simple, ubiquitous salt, became a symbol of liberty. But this newfound freedom brought challenges. Without the royal monopoly, some regions saw price fluctuations. Smugglers adapted, turning to other goods or new strategies. Some saltworks collapsed without royal contracts. The state had to rethink how it funded public needs without the gabelle's revenues. A salted legacy. The memory of the gabelle endured culturally. French literature and folklore referenced it as an emblem of injustice and perseverance. Songs, poems, and plays portrayed the faux saunier as brave folk heroes defying distant kings. In villages, salt remained a powerful metaphor for flavor, for worth, and for survival. Some families kept secret recipes for salted dishes passed down through generations, testaments to salt's role beyond seasoning. The modern salt economy fast forward to today, and salt is a global commodity. France remains famous for its saltworks, like the vast Marais Salants of Guérande, where salt has been harvested for centuries using traditional methods. These regions preserve heritage, drawing tourists eager to see centuries-old production techniques. Salt continues to flavor cuisines, cure meats, and even power industries. But the lessons of the Gabelle linger. Reflections on control and resistance. The story of the Gabelle reminds us that taxation is never just about money. It's about power. It shapes economies, communities, and identities. It fosters resistance, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud. And it reminds us how even the most ordinary substance, a pinch of salt, can carry extraordinary weight. So, as you sprinkle salt on your next meal, pause for a moment. Think of the fires that boiled brine, the canals that carried stolen salt, the songs sung by moonlight, and the stubborn hands that refused to pay. History, like salt, is everywhere, flavoring the mundane with meaning.